Hi, friends. Today we're going to talk about Congo and the Great Africa War. So we're going to rip through this pretty fast. We got about 18 slides, and I'm going to try to make it pretty quick. The reason I chose Congo is it's kind of the extreme example of colonialism and what happens after colonialism, but it isn't a big outlier, right? It's a pretty typical story. It might be a little extreme in some instances and some behaviors, but it is a typical storyline as far as how things go. So we're going to look at the 1990s, early 2000s, right? And it's basically the Congolese area. So Zaire, Democratic Republic of Congo. It had some name changes, right? Um, the story starts back in 1884. And so King Leopold of Belgium took over Congo, this area. And it wasn't a colony, it was his private little playground, right? So he, in 1906, so not 1906, I'm sorry, around 1884, he borrowed money to set up this little private fiefdom from Belgium. Then, through the profits of his different plantations and gold mining and all the other economic things that were going on, he was he was able to pay back Belgium. But the crazy part is his story is that he had one of the largest plantations ever, and it was a crazy place where a lot of times when colonies would take over, they'd institute their rules, and they'd bring the rules from the motherland to the colony. So whatever it might be, if you think of France, Belgium, Spain, whatever it might be, they'd bring those rules. Now, the indigenous people didn't necessarily, those rules always didn't apply to them. Oftentimes, when you had a colony, you would use violence or the threat of violence to maintain control. And King Leopold and his agents kind of took that to the extremes, right? That's why these pictures exist. So every person, the typical way of doing things where they were given quotas. So if you were an African working in this area, you were given a quota of gold. Say that was your job, was to dig gold, right? So if you didn't get so much gold, you or maybe one of your kids would lose a hand. And that's how it would be. Now, obviously, if it wasn't that weak or what, each person is different, but that was basically the threat that went through. And there's many, many, many pictures like this of Congolese with missing hands, missing legs, things like that. It was a brutal, brutal situation. I can't emphasize that enough, right? Now in 1906, it kind of failed, and then Belgium took over, and they were less brutal because it was, again, brought in their own rules, but it was not good either. I mean, they weren't treated as Belgians; they weren't treated as equals of the whites. They were still using fear and the threat of fear, or the violence and the threat of violence, excuse me, to maintain order. So, what happens then? When we're talking about Congolese. So when King Leopold took over, there was 20 million people, give or take, living in the area. By the time he was done, there was about 10 million people. So in that time period that we talked about, and that's a short 20, basically 20 years. So 10 million people died or left during that time, right? So when you lose 10 million people, you're going to be losing doctors, leaders, things like that. And when you have a system of violence and degradation, oftentimes the people that stand up and try to advocate for good things are the first ones that are killed. So what's left when they leave is usually a mess, and that's the story of most African countries. Is there was the land was raped, I guess would be the way to put it, and exports were taken, or materials were taken out, and then when the decolonization was happening, they just kind of left and didn't try to set up any order or any leadership or anything like that. So in 1965, now granted, there's about a 60-year gap between where we left off with Belgium taking over and where we're talking about now, but Belgium continued for those 60 years, or give or take, and then because it was in 1964, I believe, was when they got their freedom. The the Congo was free. So about a year later, Mutubu took over, right? So he staged a coup, took over the control of the government, and at first he was awesome, right? You see the notes there. Huge copper boom led to a boom in economy. He built the first dam, the hydroelectric dam. He built hospitals, schools, all sorts of good things for his people. But as he went on, and one of the interesting things was he changed the name to Zaire about 6 years after his reign started. So he got going and he started taking advantage, right? He was giving kickbacks to his friends, giving businesses to his friends, using the state-run television to, propagate propaganda and celebrate him and kind of gleam over all the bad stuff he was doing. The crazy part is he was borrowing money from foreign countries, but using it for himself, not for his country. So he was putting the country in debt, but taking that as his own money. So his power kept going for a long time, right? Anytime somebody would say anything, there was arrest, torture, exile. Rwanda is a little bit of a country right next door, right over here. It's just this little one right here. Okay, and the reason we're mentioning that is because there was an interesting history between Zaire and Rwanda, right? I graduated in 1993 from high school, and so this happened right about when I was graduating from high school. So that's why I remember most of this. So it was Rwanda's. It was an independent country before Zaire in 1962. So they got their freedom just a little bit earlier, and Rwanda's made up of basically two ethnic groups: the Hutu and the Tutsi, right? And they didn't really like each other, and so they started fighting, right? And the Tutsis were the ones that began kind of the fighting. At least that's how the story goes. And they were killing each other, and in a span of about 4 years, about 20,000 people killed, and then the interesting part was about 1.5 million people were displaced. So they because of the war they had to move. Now in 1994, Rwanda had a president, and you can see his name there. I'm not going to try to say it, but he was killed when his plane was shot down in a surface to air missile. So he was planning to land back in Rwanda, and the juvenile is right here. And so when he dies, everything goes to hell in Rwanda. And apologize for my language, but Hutus began murdering Tutsis. And all bets were off, and it just became complete civil war. So in 3 months, around 1 million people were killed. Now, Tutsis increased their attacks in Rwanda, and then this dude, Kagame, kind of took over their country. Now he's a Tutsi, right? So the Hutus fled. Most of them fled to Zaire. Okay, so they're on the border. So Kagame, that dude, and I'll back up just a little bit, was desperate to get these guys, right? They hate these two ethnic groups, hate each other. So, and he's a Tutsi, and he came up with this idea to come up with the Alliance de Forces Democratiques pour la Liberation, right? So it was made up of 6 countries, and that's why the 6 stars. And so they co-opted this group to help them kill the Hutus, right? So they co-opted this group, and that kind of led to a takeover of Zaire as well. So this group was led by Laurent Kabila, and I'm probably butchering his name. That's this dude, right? And he's leading this alliance forces, AFDL, and he not only went after the Hutus, but he also kind of took over the government. So Mobutu fled to Morocco and died there 4 months later, right? And so this guy takes over, and he changes Zaire to the Democratic Republic of Congo. So one dictator falls, rise of a new nation, has democratic in its name, thinks, oh, well, we're going to be all democratic. Well, between 1997 and 2000, everything in Congo kind of fell apart. right? The organization of the country, everything kind of just was crazy. And the ouster of Mobutu and the killing of the Hutus and everything was called the First Congo War. The Second Congo War was then a revolt against Kabila that lasted until 2002. Okay, so this is where it even takes a crazier story, or crazier turn. So fighting inside the DRC, so that's the Democratic Republic of Congo. So they were fighting each other. It's a civil war, right? And it was so much fighting, and now we're talking about 30 years of war, right? And there aren't very many people left. And so the big thing that happened during this time is there were child soldiers that were recruited or forced into fighting. And oftentimes they would hold the families hostage or even just recruit the children and offer them drugs and get them hooked on and addicted. And that would and so the kids would fight for the drugs. Basically, they would go to war and fight, and then they would be given drugs to fill their addiction, which is crazy when you think about it. And you can see the pictures here. And no, those aren't staged. Those aren't made up. Those are actual pictures. So fighting continues, and it was a long time, right? So it was like 10 years. Why did the fighting continue? It was profitable. The soldiers were making money, except for the child soldiers, obviously. They were making money. For gun runners were making money. The adult soldiers were making money because they'd get paid on the child recruits. Everybody was making money, right? In January 2001, Kabila was assassinated by some of his child soldiers, and so it finally ended. And then a bunch of African diplomats from other countries negotiated a ceasefire with the leaders of the different militias. Now, it was also overseen by the largest UN force ever assembled, which is kind of an interesting thing, right? So now so in July 30th, 2006, the Democratic Republic of Congo held elections, right? So no single president candidate won a majority, and then they had a runoff, and then Kabila's son actually became the first democratically elected president. So, right, so I mean, the government's in shambles. There's profits that are trying to help, and churches and everything. I mean, it's a complete disaster, right? So then Kabila gets elected, and the election seems, like it's legit. But then he turns right to his father's way of doing things and uses violence to silence his rivals. The problem is he had very little control over most of his soldiers, so he didn't. It was a loose control, and the parliament kept voting for salary increases for themselves while not really doing much government, and the soldiers were kind of running amok because they didn't have much control. And so now in 2009, there was a survey done by the UN as far as it's called the Human Development Index, right? So how developed a country is. They were the fifth from bottom in the entire world, right? In 2009, so about 10 years ago, as far as their development of human infrastructure and how so basic, health, education, standard of living, that kind of stuff. So 30% of the whole country is illiterate. If more than half have no access to clean water. And you can see this is UN aid stations, people looking for river water and cleaning. There's signs, you can notice it, the German flag there, but it basically says, don't do rape, that kind of thing. So it is still a democratic republic. They did have elections. In 2007, they made a deal with the Republic of China. So China agrees to put $9 billion so in infrastructure, roads, bridges, that kind of stuff. And in return, the DRC would give China future revenue from their resources, right? So it's a little bit like New Age colonialism, right? So they're building infrastructure. They are giving money and things, but they get a very large chunk of all the profits that come along. And you're going to start seeing that because, excuse me, um, number one, Africa's huge. Number two, Africa has a large area that can grow food. And you're going to see, and this is my prediction, and this isn't history, this is in the future. You're going to see Africa become a neo-colonialism area where China, the U.S., maybe even Europe start investing and making farmland and using the land of China as a farm to a way to feed their country, right? So yeah, so modern Africa and the DRC. So we tend to think about Africa kind of negatively. That it's kind of monolithic. So monolithic means it's all one and it's not changing, right? But it's hugely diverse. 7 of 10 fasting developing countries in the world are in Africa. Unfortunately, the DRC is not one of them, but it is one of the largest countries in Africa, and it probably has the most resources: gold, silver, metals, that kind of stuff. Um, and the Chinese are really heavy into the DRC. So it's worth looking at, paying attention to, and into the future. And I think you're going to see more and more investment, foreign investment, into the DRC as we go along. All right, so that's it. Let me know if you have any questions. Have a good day, and yeah, take care.